welcome to Wednesday Night Church. We've been doing this the last 3 weeks before tonight, and we're continuing that still. Tonight, we're going to be talking about don't waste your suffering. And we're going to be, as you can see up on the screen, in Philippians. So if you have a Bible, you can turn to Philippians chapter 1. We'll be getting there in just shortly. All the verses will be on the screen if you don't have a Bible. But over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about overcoming fear and overcoming worry and overcoming anger. And all of these things can be from the result of people or circumstances in our lives. And so these things, we want to overcome those things, but we also want to talk about in that line of how do we not waste the suffering that we go through that may cause our anger, worry, and fear. And that's what we're going to hit on tonight. Now, Philippians. Paul is writing this. He writes it under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. He's writing about this. He's writing about joy. This whole book is about joy. He's writing about it from prison. And this passage is not about prison, but it's about suffering. And the Bible tells us that God will work all things for the good of those who love Him. We love that verse, don't we? We like to quote that verse. It makes us feel good when we say this verse. But then, in the midst of tragedy, it can be hard to picture God working it out for our good. You know what I mean? Like in the aftermath of a tornado or flood. When we receive bad news about something, about our health, when we lose our job, when we lose someone we love, it can sure feel like God is distant. It can sure feel like God has failed in His duty. And suffering, let me tell you what, it doesn't play favorites. It doesn't matter what your gender, your race, your economic status or background. It doesn't matter what those are because everybody suffers. And so the question I want to ask tonight, and you see it up here, is not will I suffer, but how will I suffer? And to start off, we have to ask the question, where does suffering come from? This tells us that it comes from hard circumstances, the hard things that we face in our lives. And so that makes us ask another question, and that is, where do hard circumstances, hard things come from? Why are there hard circumstances, trials, hardships? Why is there so much suffering? Well, theologians say we suffer because we live in a fallen world, right? In Genesis chapter 3, our first parents decided that they wanted to be their own God. They basically said to God, well, thanks for creating us and loving us, but we're going to do our own thing. And since then, we have all followed in the footsteps of Adam and Eve. We've tried to be our own saviors and be our own God. And Genesis chapter 3 tells us that God dealt with this in several ways, but one of those ways that He dealt with this is that He cursed the ground. The earth was originally pictured, and really it was a beautiful garden where Adam and Eve hung out with God. It was a perfect environment. And God was saying, just as your hearts are out of order and rebellious, I am going to make the earth out of order and rebellious to remind us of our rebelliousness against God. This is not the world that God intended. And there's a lot of suffering in our lives, right? Suffering comes again from hard circumstances. Suffering also can come from people. And in this passage, Paul is talking about persecution. And persecution is that systematic mistreatment of an individual group by another individual or group. This can be religious or it can be not religious. And in Philippians, this is religious persecution. And there can be times when you get persecuted from people outside of the church. And that's why Paul says in verse 28 here, don't be afraid of persecution. And many of us won't face physical persecution, but we will all face non-physical persecution. Here in America, we don't get persecuted too much from outside of the church, but we actually get persecuted more from inside the church. And this is what's happening to Paul in this time. And so if you look at verse 15, chapter 1 of Philippians, it says, It's true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. So there were some people in the church who were envious of Paul, and he goes on to say in verse 16 that the latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of a selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. And so there was literally people in the church that were wanting bad things to happen to Paul. Crazy when you think about it. But when a church preaches the gospel of Jesus, they will be attacked. It's just the way it happens. And some of that will come from those who are Christians. And it's sad. But that's why there's so many, thousands upon thousands of different denominations of the church. And most of the persecution that will be in our lives is not going to be a physical persecution. We're going to have some mean people in our lives. And how many of us can say that we've got some mean people in our lives? And you didn't pick them, but they're there. And we wish we could take some of the mean out of those people, right? Well, I can say, all I know about mean people in our lives, this is what I can say, is that we learn a lot about ourselves because of mean people in our lives. We learn a lot about our self-righteousness, how much self-righteousness we have in our lives. We think to ourselves, don't they know that I'm a really good person? Why are they treating me like this? We learn how much anger we have. How badly do you want to get revenge on that person? We learn how much we live for the approval of other people. Because when somebody criticizes you and you are devastated by that, it shows you how much you long for the approval of others. And if you're a follower of Jesus, if you're a Christian, let me just tell you, you're going to suffer from time to time. Suffering will happen. And you will suffer because this is a fallen world. And this is hard for us because much of contemporary Christian teaching and preaching that we hear today is if you come to Jesus, He will bring you health, wealth, and peace. Now, do I believe that there is peace, health, and wealth in Jesus? Sure, definitely. But if that is your motive to come to Jesus, you may have a problem. People come into Christianity under the illusion that Jesus comes to serve them, that He makes sure that you will never struggle or you'll never suffer, and that there's never going to be any pain in your life. And that's really the American version of Jesus, not the biblical Jesus. And when Paul was converted to Christianity, right, the first message that Paul receives from Jesus after Jesus knocks him off his horse, blinds him, and after being led around by some people because he's now blind, this is the message that God gives to him. It's in Acts chapter 9. And here God tells Ananias to go to Paul and tell him this. And this is what he tells him in Acts chapter 9, verse 15. He says, "Go. This man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name." This would never work for a church sign, right? Come to our church and we promise you a lifetime of suffering, hardship. And you may say, well, come on, that was just Paul. I'm not a preacher. I'm not a pastor. I'm just trying to go to my work and my job and just do all these things. Well, Jesus told us in John chapter 16, verse 33, that in this world you will have trouble. And so if you follow Jesus, you're going to hurt from time to time. You're going to struggle from time to time. You're going to have some pain from time to time. And so Paul, if we remember, as I already said at the beginning of this, Paul is writing this letter in prison, sitting in prison. He's under house arrest for sharing his faith in Jesus. And he's made an appeal to Caesar. He's waiting his trial in Rome. And to keep him secure in prison, he would have been chained by the wrist or the ankle to a Roman guard at all times. And the reference to palace guard is literally Praetorian guard. And these were 1,000 hand-picked soldiers who were first commissioned by Caesar Augustus, and they were strategically dispersed all throughout Rome to keep the peace and to protect the emperor. And so these chains that were referred to here in verse 14 were about 18 inches long. That's how long they were, very short. One was attached to the prisoner's wrist or ankle, and the other was attached to the soldier. The guard, or that chain, would not be removed from this prisoner as long as he was in custody, as long as he was in jail. And this made both escape and privacy, impossible. And a speedy trial for a first-century prisoner in Rome was not guaranteed. A prisoner could wait months or even years before having the opportunity to present his or her case in front of the judge. And this timetable for trial was often based on the whims of the magistrate, and sometimes the prisoner was used as a bargaining chip for whatever they were trying to get. And if they held off long enough, the prisoner might even be able to buy his or her freedom with a bribe. And so getting a prisoner to trial was not always the magistrate's concern. History tells us that Paul waited in prison for 2 years before he was able to make his case in front of a judge. And during imprisonment, the Roman government was not worried about the welfare of the prisoner. There wasn't any constitutional guarantee of humane treatment. There wasn't a TV. There wasn't a gym. There wasn't 3 square meals a day. The prisoner in Paul's time would have been dependent upon paying the guards or other people to provide for them for the necessities of life, that would be food, water, clean clothes. It would have been a miserable situation physically and emotionally. And so the question that we were talking about Paul and suffering, we're talking about our suffering and our hardships. The question that we need to ask ourselves is, will we suffer well? See, one of the things that happens when we suffer well is, as followers of Jesus, as people, is that people outside the faith get intrigued by us suffering well. When you go through hard times without whining or complaining, without blaming everybody and getting bitter at the situation, people around you just can't believe that. In fact, it amazes them. In Acts chapter 16, the jailer became a Christian by watching Paul and Silas and how they responded to their suffering in prison. How you go through suffering is very important because there are people listening and watching. This is what happened to Paul. Look at verse 12 and 13 here, Philippians 1. He says, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, this is what happened to me, has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result," he's saying, "of my imprisonment, as a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ." Now, can I just paraphrase what he was saying there right now? He says, I want you to know what seems to be so horrible, which is me being in chains, has turned out to be good, actually. This is a remarkable statement, isn't it? Picture this just for a moment. I have cancer, but it's a good thing. I lost my job, but it's a good thing. My wife left me and took the children, but it's a good thing. When we read this, we need to understand that there is a dual tone taking place. In one sense, Paul is declaring his innocence. He wants the people in Philippi to understand that he has not done anything illegal. He's not been placed in prison because of some misconduct that he's done. Instead, he is in chains for preaching Jesus Christ. On the other hand, though, Paul is sharing the results of his imprisonment. He says, I'm in chains for Christ. It's the reason that Paul was in prison. And Paul says that Jesus is using his chains for good. The gospel is advancing because of all this. And we read this and we realize that there's a bit of sweet irony taking place here, right? Paul has been placed under house arrest, so the story of Jesus would not advance anymore. Like he couldn't preach anymore, right? But instead, Caesar's own guards are hearing the message of Jesus. And the guards who are chained to Paul, who are to keep him from sharing the gospel, are hearing it. And they end up being the ones that are probably captive more than Paul. And Paul is sharing the good news with them. How would you like to be one of those guards chained to Paul? You would hear him pray. You would hear him talk about Jesus. And apparently some of those guards became Christians, and they began to tell their friends and their family about Jesus. So how does all of this apply to us tonight? Well, many of us have friends who are not followers of Jesus, and they are watching you, and they are listening to you, and they're listening to what you are preaching. And you may be saying, well, I don't preach sermons. Well, really you do. It's called your life, and people are watching you. The main point that will get them to know Jesus is going to be the sermon that you preach when you go through something that is hard, when you go through suffering, hardships, difficult circumstances. And it's when you go through those things with joy. Now, it's not fake joy, but it's authentic joy through whatever the hardship is that you are facing. This speaks to Christians and it speaks to non-Christians. People are amazed by this. Paul goes on in verse 14 and he says, "And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear." Now, I don't want to waste my suffering. Do you know that you can waste your suffering? So again, how does this apply to us? Well, to go through suffering, we have to rest in God's sovereignty. And that means that we have to understand that God has everything under control. And you may say, well, what does that mean? Well, Paul says that in verse 12. He says, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel." So what happened to him? Prison. Now look at verse 16. "Knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel." Where is he put? Prison. Who put him in prison? Circumstances didn't put him there. Harsh people didn't put him there. God put him there. We see this throughout Scripture, right? Psalm 103:19. "The Lord has established his throne in the heavens, and his sovereignty rules over all." Job 42 verse 2 says, "I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted." Isaiah 46:10 says, "My purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure," God says. God is in complete and total control over everything. And that is very comforting to us if we really understand that and we believe that with all of our hearts. God is in charge of whatever situation that we find ourselves in. That's comforting until you go through suffering, right? When you really believe that God is in charge and then you suffer, a lot of questions come into your head at that moment. Because if God is in charge, did God cause the hardship that I'm going through, or did God allow the hardship that I'm going through? And these are those philosophical debates that I don't have all the answers to. But I do know that God can stop some things that he doesn't stop. And I don't know why always. If he's in charge and he allows me to suffer, that makes me think, is God really good? I know he's there and I know he's in control, but this is so painful, this is so hard. So is God really good? And we can ask, is God really completely in control? If we don't like the way things are going in our lives, and this is just an easy question to ask. We want to think that maybe God doesn't have everything under his control, because why would he let this happen to me? Or we think, is God punishing me through this hard circumstance or this harsh people that are in my life? And this is the problem with evil. And it's always been this way, and it always will be until Christ returns. And there's a reason, right, that this is called the problem of evil, because it really is a problem. And too many Christians don't want to think about this. They want to stay shallow, but deep down in our hearts, this is where we wrestle with these kind of things, these kind of questions. And if we believe in a God powerful enough to control the events in our lives, surely we can believe in the kind of God that has plans and purposes beyond our comprehension and understanding. He is able to use these things in a way that we don't totally understand right then in the moment. Now, does this answer all the questions we have about this? No. But what about you? Where are you? Where are you? What's going on in your mind when you think about this? In Acts chapter 17, verse 26, it tells us, "From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed time and the boundaries of their lands." Let me just tell you something. God has put you where you live, where you are. He has determined this. God has put you where you are so you would seek him and reach out to him, and so that from wherever you are, you would find him. God is not hiding from us. He actually wants us to find him. He has put us all where we are to try and reach us. And it's to try and get us into a relationship with him. And if we've already got a relationship with him, it's to that we would deepen that relationship with him. And we really understand this, that God is allowing some hard things in our lives, not because he hates you, not because he's mad at you, but because he's trying to get your attention, because a lot of times we are stubborn and we don't listen to him unless some things are going on in our lives to get our attention, some chaotic things maybe. And when you really know that God is really in charge and that he is there and he is truly, trying to love you, here's what you do. You learn to rejoice in your relationship with Jesus more than any other person or any other thing, anything else. And we see in verses 20 and 21, he says, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. For you to live is what? For Paul, it was Jesus. It was Jesus. What is it for you to live? What are your hopes and your dreams? What is the thing that you rely on? Is it your career? Is it your relationship with somebody else? Is it your kids? Your God is what you take joy in. Timothy Keller says this, what you rejoice in is the thing that is your central sweetness and consolation in life. To rejoice is to treasure a thing, to assess its value, to reflect on its beauty and importance until your heart rests in it and tastes the sweetness of it. And so this leaves us with a question. What do we find joy in? What is your joy centered on? Maybe that's the better question. We have to ask ourselves, if somebody evaluated my life, what would they say is my good news? When bad news comes, would they see that I still believe in the good news of Jesus? The story of Jesus will advance through us only when we see this and treat it like it's good news, right? We see that Jesus is the central thing in our lives. That's where we get that sweetness of it. And so, if you handle suffering well, you will learn to put others' needs ahead of your wants. You see that God is sovereign over everything. That he's in your life and he's using all these things so that you can rejoice in him, you can even find sweetness in your pain. Look at verse 22 and 24 through 24 up there. It says, if I'm to go on living in this body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far, but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. So what is he saying? He says, my suffering is not just about me. He would rather go and be in heaven with God, but he knows that there is a reason that he lives and he continues to suffer in prison. So suffering is about you. It is about me. God is trying to love you and he's trying to deepen your relationship with him. And the suffering is to get through to our stubbornness that we have, because many times we don't listen until things get hard. But your suffering is not just about you. You're suffering for others. And I want you to suffer well so that others can suffer well, because other people are going to suffer. Right? And most people don't suffer well because they have not been taught how to suffer well. They've never had someone teach them and show them what it means to suffer well. So do you hear what Paul is saying in this? Paul suggests that suffering is a gift. It's been granted to you on your behalf to suffer for God. And if you're like me, that idea just sounds way out there, like foreign to you, right? That doesn't seem like that would be the way that God would work. Doesn't God want me to be comfortable? What are the things that we ask God for? Like, what are our prayers? We listen to our prayers, right? we really believe deep down that God wants us comfortable more than anything else. Because that's what we pray for. And if I found a genie in a bottle, one of the last requests that I would ever ask for would be for suffering. We need to learn to receive suffering as a gift. It's a gift. He goes on into verse 29, and he says, "For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him." Now, if you believe in Jesus, it's because God has gifted that. And if you suffer, it's because God has gifted that. And you can only see suffering as a gift if you see that God has already suffered for you, right? How can we worship God if he's immune to our suffering and our pain? If he doesn't know what that's like. Because in the middle of suffering, when it's really hard and it's really hurtful, I mean really, really hard, we can feel like God has given up on us and he's abandoned us, he's left us. And we say, "God, where are you? I'm in the midst of this and I don't know where you are. Have you left me?" What did Jesus say when he was on the cross? "God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus knows what it is like to suffer, and he was innocent. Most of the time, we aren't very innocent when we suffer. Some of us are in prison, right? You may be in prison in your body, like your body's falling apart. But what would happen if those of us who are chained to doctors and nurses, we shared the good news while we were in the hospital? What if they saw us able to rejoice in the midst of our suffering? Your marriage may be in prison, maybe a prison. Like there's very little emotional connectedness there. And it just feels like a prison. Some of you are suffering for other reasons, and not because of anything that you did. It was because of what somebody else has done to you. Let me tell you, I want you to suffer well. I want you to learn to follow Jesus, who suffered well. And we will suffer, but will we suffer well? And sometimes the world hurts because we are Christians. And so what would happen if our suffering became a means to share the good news of Jesus? And how you handle your suffering will speak volumes to a world that is also hurting and seeking a solution. And if we complain about it, if there's bitterness and anger toward it, then it will not be seen as any other difference. And people will certainly think, well, trusting in Jesus won't do me any good if they're the same as I am. Where are we today in our suffering? How we handle suffering? We have to see who Jesus is and that he suffered too. So know that we can understand and we can go to him and trust him in the midst of our suffering. Can we rejoice in the gift that we have in Jesus and see God working when we go through suffering? And that's the opportunity we have, is to look to Jesus in the midst of our suffering so that we can trust him in the middle of it, knowing that he has not left us, he has not abandoned us, and know that God may use that suffering so that we can help others suffer well, that we can show people how they can suffer in the midst of it. And so that's our opportunity tonight. Would you bow your heads as we close with prayer? Heavenly Father, I just pray for every one of us here, Lord, that's just watching tonight. I pray that they would be able to suffer well. That when they go through hardships and difficult circumstances, that they'd be able to suffer well. They'd be able to go through it looking to you, Jesus, knowing that you suffered and you did nothing wrong. You suffered for us on the cross. You took all of the sin on you. Help us to know that we have not been left alone. We have not been abandoned by God, but that you are with us, God. And that you love us, and you've left that there for a reason. If we are suffering, it's there for a reason. And I pray that we would look to you and find our source of joy in you, God. That would be our source of joy. Yes, we find joy in other things, but our main source of joy would be you, that we understand that you are our hope. You are our light. You are our joy, because we are sons and daughters of you through faith in Jesus. And so let us just rest in that. And help us to not have bitterness and anger, but that we might find joy in our relationship with you, knowing that you are working that in our lives to make us better, to draw us nearer to you. It's in your holy name we pray. Amen. And so if you're suffering, if you're in hardship, would you let us know so we can pray with you and encourage you? But just know that God has left that there for a reason, to draw you nearer to him, or maybe even to draw you to him if you've never come to him. And so that we can show others how we can truly suffer well. God bless you. Rejoice in him. We'll see you Sunday.